Can we?
Yes, Mr. Goonetilleke.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Shankar Menon.
Good afternoon.
Very happy to have you with us today with your distinguished service as in the Indian Foreign Service, as head of mission in many countries, including Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan, as Foreign Secretary, as a National Security Advisor of India, and now as an academic and a prolific writer. There is much to learn from your vast experience. To understand what you are doing currently, can you please tell us how you have kept yourself busy since your last assignment as the National Security Advisor of India?
Well, thank you for having me. It's good of you to have me on your platform. Frankly, since being National Security Advisor, when I left government after 42 years in working for government, I thought best to do something quite different. So, and I tried to do things that I had not done before. So the first thing I did was to try and teach and to try and write a book, which I did. I wrote a book called Choices, which had one chapter actually on Sri Lanka, on some of the experiences with Sri Lanka. And then I found I actually really enjoyed teaching. I mean, it was a stretch because it wasn't something I was used to. And being with young people really, challenges you because they don't have all the assumptions and the experience, and they've not had their edges ground off by life the way people like you and I are. So for me, it was really exhilarating almost. So if I had known it was so good, I would have retired a long time ago, quite frankly, because the wonderful part of it is that you choose what you do. This sense of freedom is something that I have truly enjoyed. And I've managed now to read books that I had been keeping for years to read. So that's really what I've been doing. I feel a bit self-indulgent actually, but I must say I've enjoyed retirement, if this is retirement.
Excellent, excellent. India and Asian and present, and share your experience and foresight with your friends in Sri Lanka. We have approximately 45 minutes for our discussion, which will be followed by questions from the audience, if there are any. So to start, your publication has 13 chapters. Unfortunately, we are not able to go into the contents of all 13 chapters. Instead, I will have to cherry pick issues that would be interest to the Sri Lankan audience. In doing so, we will have to focus on some issues and subjects, giving disproportionate attention to some specific areas in your book. Now, to start with chapter 10, entitled Viewing Asia from India. You have said that China's involvement with South Asian countries, with the exception of Pakistan, is relatively new, but growing rapidly. In that, you were thinking of Chinese investment and trade in South Asia. China's pledges under the BRI to South Asia are more than 100 billion in investments as well as loans. With the exception of India, international FDI do not flow freely to other countries in South Asia. We have to admit that India cannot match China in investment and trade. The question is, from the Indian point of view, how could India effectively address or balance South Asia's tilt towards China due to their economic necessities? Over to you.
You know, quite frankly, I don't see this as some zero-sum competition between India and China. China has her interests in South Asia and has things that she is good at, which I think, frankly, South Asia should use. It's in South Asia's interest to use that. There are things that India has an interest in and things that India is good at, that India brings to the table. And these are different because India and China are not identical societies. The economies are different, both in size and in the way they have developed, and also in what they concentrate on. Chinese are very good at building infrastructure, for instance. Indians have traditionally been much more involved in trade, in services, and because they come from a society that is much more like other South Asian societies, have certain strengths which I don't think China has. For instance, I mean, because of sheer proximity and the fact that there are cross-border ethnicities across every border, every boundary in South Asia, in the subcontinent, frankly, the degree of integration is much closer with India. And that's just a fact. But it's also natural that all these new states, old nations in South Asia will look for external balancing for India's preponderant presence. That's natural. So they used to go to the US when the US in the 60s, 70s. Now they go to China and China comes. But from India's point of view, as long as India's interests are being served, it's not about competing with China, keeping China out. No, it's not zero sum here. India wants a prosperous and peaceful periphery. India cannot develop alone, and India cannot be at peace if the periphery is not at peace. So India has an interest, a fundamental interest in our neighbors developing along with India and in the peace and security of the region. And that interest is fundamental. For China, South Asia is a secondary theater. She has more, as she keeps describing it strategically, for her, her primary concerns are the Eastern Front, are the containment that she sees the US enforcing along the First Island chain. It's a reunification with Taiwan. These are the things that she would list much higher in her priorities. That doesn't mean she won't do Belt and Road. That doesn't mean she's not committed. As you said, $100 billion is not a small amount. It's a big commitment. Because South Asia matters increasingly, the Indian Ocean matters increasingly, both to China and to other powers, and is now central to global geopolitics. So South Asia is going to see much more attention, much more involvement by others. And as I argue in the book, India just needs to up its game in order to protect Indian interests, not to do anybody else down, but to at least guarantee and protect Indian interests. That's the way I would look at it. So I don't see this as some, oh, China's done something, we must balance this. No, unless it affects Indian interests, then frankly, we should deal with the Chinese, we should deal with our friends in the neighborhood.
Thank you. You have not taken India's relations with specific South Asian countries separately in your book. Understandably, it would have been too much of a task.
I don't want to write the ministry's the annual report of the Ministry of External Affairs.
Right. Since you have served in Sri Lanka as India's High Commissioner towards the latter part of 1990s and taking stock of the current ground situation, what can be done by both countries to cast away mutual suspicions, address fundamental fault lines, and further strengthen bilateral relations between our two countries?
Well, I think that, you know, it's important that concerns that either side has are talked out very quickly. And the most important thing between the two is constant communication. We've seen this in the past. we are two separate countries. We will have differences in the way we look at certain problems, but we need to make sure that where we differ, we are not creating misunderstanding or misperceptions, which then lead to other problems. And I think number one is as much communication as possible, and strategic communication at the highest level. The other thing I would say is we are part of each other's lives, whether we like it or not, economically, politically, in various ways, culturally. And I think we need to build on that. Frankly, we should use that as a strength. And I think our goal in India should be that Sri Lanka sees us as a source of both prosperity and stability in the region and on security. I don't see between India and Sri Lanka really very much of any differences that we cannot talk through or manage today. There are some fears on the Sri Lankan side, which I think just stem from the situation of being swamped by the Indian economy. Those kinds of fears, I think, are natural. But frankly, experience shows that that hasn't happened. If anything, it's the other way around. I would like Sri Lanka to look at the Indian economy as an opportunity for Sri Lanka. There's a huge market, but also, and not just as a source of goods and so on, but a place where Sri Lanka can actually become a much bigger economic power and grow her economy. On the security side, I think both sides know each other's red lines, know each other's sensitivities. We have a common interest in huge host of things: maritime security, counterterrorism. I mean, the list is very long where we can cooperate, we can work together. And I think we should do that. So I'm actually a relative optimist. I think we've gone through much worse times, much harder times, and we've managed them successfully. And if we could do that, I think we can handle today's situation quite easily.
Thank you. Ambassador Menon, in the recent past, there were considerable discussions and debates in Sri Lanka about the need for either amending the constitution or coming up with a new constitution that would satisfy all segments of the population. In the course of that discussion, views were expressed about the need to find an alternative to the provincial council system that was introduced as a result of the Indo-Lanka Agreement in 1987, which saw the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That was, of course, almost 35 years ago. My question is, to what extent India is wedded to the 13th Amendment? And what would be India's reaction if a new constitution or an amendment is adopted, introducing a new unit of devolution in place of the current provincial council system?
Let me make it quite clear. I speak only for myself. And that's the joy of being retired, as we said at the beginning.
Yes, of course.
My opinion is quite clear. In any case, the 13th Amendment was an amendment to the Sri Lankan Parliament, constitution passed by the Sri Lankan Parliament of Sri Lanka's own free will. There's no mention of this constitution in the in the India-Sri Lanka agreement. There's no mention of the amendment. So the idea that somehow this is a result of India's organizing the amendment and so on, I think that's not true. Provincial councils are not Indian creations, they're Sri Lankan creations. If you accept that, then frankly, it is for Sri Lankans, all Sri Lankans, to decide among themselves how they want to run their affairs. And that would be my approach, but that's me. The problem is, of course, if you ask any Indian, he will tell you his opinion. We, just like if you, and this is why I liked being in Sri Lanka, if you ask any Sri Lankan, what do you think? He will tell you his opinion, whether it's your internal affair or not. He will tell you what he thinks. Every Indian will tell you. And there are many Indians who are very invested, either because of shared ethnicity or for other reasons, who are very invested in Sri Lanka emotionally and politically at home. After all, many of these issues cross the boundary. So I think today we have worked ourselves into a really confused situation. I honestly think that politicians find it useful to use the other country to achieve what they want at home. Whether it is Indian politicians using the Sri Lankan issue as they do in the South, or whether it is Sri Lankan politicians saying, oh, this is, after all, this is an Indian amendment. This is, we have to think about India and so on. And then they get what they want at home. But ultimately, this is for Sri Lanka to do and to decide how to arrange her own affairs. If you ask us, we'll tell you our opinion. If you ask experts, they'll tell you how it could be done. That's also been happened in the past. After all, between friends, you talk about these things. But ultimately, it is a Sri Lankan call. And therefore, and this is why I say I speak only for myself. I don't think this is the reply you'd get from all Indians or from, I don't know about the most, but certainly not from all Indians.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that clarification. Now let us move on to chapter 11 of your book. The title is China Rising. Chapter 11 of your book has been devoted to China. Speaking of options for China with regard to Beijing's relations with its neighbors, you have highlighted 3 options for China to choose from. The third option was to work with significant local powers in the region and its periphery to evolve a new security order involving Japan, India, Indonesia, Republic of Korea, and Vietnam. You have highlighted the fact that these countries share the common interest in maintaining security and freedom of navigation. Instead, you have said China has chosen to go its own way. My question is, in your thinking, what was the reason for China to take that particular decision, rather than working in cooperation with its influential neighbors for advancement of common security, development, and prosperity?
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 factors at play. One is there is a very strong Chinese sense of exceptionalism, that China is unique, that China is different, that China's experience, history, everything is unique to China. And China is not the only one. I mean, many great powers. You look at the US, they have a very strong sense of exceptionalism. But the US, and it took the US something like 50 years before they actually started involving themselves in the affairs of the world and started building alliance systems. It took 2 world wars actually to drag them into the world. With the Chinese, I think the rise has been so fast because China has really advanced rapidly in 30 years. And I think because China had troubled relations with many of these countries that you've mentioned, Japan, Vietnam, and so on, complicated relations with India. So I think she chose the easier option. But I can't speak for China. I can't read their minds. I was just saying that logically, there were various ways of dealing with this. Now, today, unfortunately, what you see is over the last 15 years, I think China's relations with most of the larger countries on her periphery have actually got more complicated. With India, relations have been in crisis since last year, since what happened on the border. With Japan, the East China Sea, Senkaku Diaoyu is a big issue. And she has worked herself into, because she didn't choose that path, and maybe because of choices that the other countries made also, because there's an action and reaction here. We've worked ourselves into classic security dilemmas, where each side thinks what they're doing is defensive, but the other side sees it as offensive and then reacts to it. So again, then this side says, oh my God, the balance has changed, I have to do something. So you get into an escalatory spiral where each one is reacting, each one thinks they're being defensive, but the other side sees it as offensive, and you get into and that is the situation we're in today. If you look across Asia, all the hotspots are live. All the flashpoints are hot. whether it is East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, India-China boundary, you look at Yemen, you look across, and today even Palestine. So you have this set of flashpoints which have become much hotter than they were, say, 10, 15 years ago. And a lot of it is a reaction to the very rapid rise of China and the accumulation of hard power by China.
Related to that is
I don't say all of it, and I'm not saying it's all Chinese responsibility, because I think that this is a dynamic.
Thank you. Related to that is another issue, that is, you have characterized China as a global power in economic terms, a regional power in military terms, and a dominant power, but not a hegemon in the Asia-Pacific region. Do you foresee the Chinese stance changing in the near or medium term?
Well, this is meant more as a description of reality than as a description of the Chinese stance. I mean, I was just saying this is the fact today. Lee Kuan Yew used to say that, if I were a Chinese leader, I would naturally seek primacy. And good luck to them in seeking it. But if they do achieve primacy, good luck to us. And I think that's the process we are in, where other people are reacting to what they perceive as a Chinese ambition to achieve primacy. As long as they were following Deng Xiaoping's policy of hide and bide, of hiding their lights, of not taking leadership, of biding their time while they built up their own strength, I think the world went along with this. But for the last 8-10 years, they've abandoned that. Now they talk of China taking center stage, of China playing a role. They talk of major power relationships, of great power relationships. So given that shift, once ambition is revealed, you can't pull it back. It's like words, once they've been said, there's no withdrawing them. You can explain them away, do whatever you like. But once ambition is revealed, other people will assume and act on that assumption and will assume that you are seeking primacy. And China has revealed ambition in the last few years. I think that's the big change. And what you're seeing is the reaction to that and how China copes with that reaction also. And that's an interesting phenomenon, because some of this wolf warrior diplomacy that we see is maybe part of the reaction. So this is why I call it a dynamic. And I'm not here saying that so-and-so is at fault, so-and-so is at fault. We are in a situation whether we like it or not. Some things have happened, and we are now watching it playing itself out. The American pushback against China is a reaction to China's rise, because the US policy since World War II has been to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. And whether it was the Soviet Union, whether in the 80s it was Japan, which was handled with the Plaza Accords, or whether it's now China as a potential peer competitor. She isn't yet, but she's on her way there. And certainly economically, she's already there. But it's a complicated situation. It's not only the US and China who are economically codependent. India and China too have complicated relations, but are economically codependent. Last year, the year of the crisis on the border, actually India's trade despite it being a COVID year and so on, China became India's #1 trading partner again, overtook the US, which in 2019, the US had overtaken China. So frankly, how this plays out is very hard to say, which is why I don't make predictions. I say there are possibilities, but I try very hard, and that's why it's called the past present. There's no future in the title.
No future. Okay, China's assertion of becoming a world power and Beijing's wish to take the center stage globally, as you mentioned a little while ago, was highlighted by Chinese President Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. Now, in your opinion, to what extent Trump administration's policy to withdraw from the center stage contributed to that situation? Or was President Xi in a hurry for some reason or other, as some believe, to move China to the center stage somewhat prematurely, ignoring former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's famous advice, what you mentioned a little while ago, biding one's time and hiding one's light?
Very hard to tell how much was, a reaction, how much was, but I don't think that this was really just a reaction to Trump's election. I don't think anybody expected Trump to get elected, by the way, in 2016. And this is not something that happened after November 2016. This is something which had been building, whether it is building up the PLA, whether it is changing the doctrines on which they operate, whether it is shifting away from Deng's hide and bide strategy. All that had started long before in 2012. In fact, some of what China was doing in the South China Sea, for instance, had started even before that, in 2008, after which, in fact, Xi Jinping, before he became president, was head of the leading group, of the small leading group among the leadership, which handled South China Sea issues. So many of these things actually can go, you can take them back to 2008. For me, the more critical development was the global financial crisis of 2008, because it could have appeared to the Chinese that the West was in terminal decline, and that the US was also in decline, was vacating the stage, that they would be so busy taking care of their own economies, trying to revive them and so on, that this was China's moment in the sun. And it seems to me that many of these changes, therefore, can be dated back to the 2008-2012 period, at least the beginnings of these changes, of a more assertive Chinese policy, of a broader definition of Chinese interests. South China Sea becomes a core interest. In the past, it used to be just Tibet and Taiwan. There's an emphasis on sovereignty in disputes, for instance, which in the past used to be, these are disputed, so we'll do give and take. You'll get some, we'll get some, but we'll accommodate. That is the much more strident nationalism that we see, not just in official statements, but in China encouraged officially. All this, I think, is part of this process, this shift. So I wouldn't say it's because of Trump alone. Trump may have helped. Actually, in fact, I think Trump, by the manner in which he dealt with China, especially by, calling it Chinese virus, by applying tariffs, by cutting down on visas for Chinese students and so on, he actually consolidated Chinese nationalism and probably helped the Chinese leadership to get their way domestically, to get increased domestic support for a much stronger and more assertive nationalist line abroad. So it's the other way around, I think. I think the line was coming already. Trump, I think, actually helped it along.
Yeah.
And probably strengthened the hand of those who were arguing that China had to go its own way.
All right. Related issue, the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping famously told Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in December 1988 that the 21st century would not be the Asian country if India and China failed to develop together. That statement was made more than 3 decades ago. According to your assessment, how valid is this statement today?
Well, I think it's still valid, but if you look at the overall trend since then, since 1988 December, when Deng said that to Rajiv Gandhi, the trend is for both India and China to develop, and both have developed, actually have done what they've never done before in history. They've grown much faster than ever before. Right now, everybody is diminished by COVID, and the world economy also has taken a huge hit. But if you look at the secular trend over the decades from 88, he wasn't far wrong. And it's still true. Today, over half of Asia's GDP is, when excluding Japan, is China and India. And so when he says, if you want nation century, both these countries have to develop, he's right. What he didn't say, but is implicit in that statement, is these countries also have to learn to get along with each other and not waste their energy on fighting with each other. That otherwise it won't be an Asian century. It might be a Chinese century, it might be an Indian century, it might be some other century, maybe an American century. But I think implicit in his statement, but it's interesting, if you actually read the text of the statement, it's very conditional. It's not a prediction. He's not saying this is likely to happen. He's only saying, if you want an Asian century, this is an essential condition. He doesn't mention all the other essential conditions. But I think it follows from the way he's placed it and from what he did, because he's the one who then helped to set in place the modus vivendi between the two countries, which actually kept the peace for 30 years, kept the border peaceful, and enabled both of us to concentrate on what was important, which is our own development and other relationships. So I think he was quite wise in what he said. And I still think it's true that, yes, we can fritter away our energies in, in conflict or competition.
Skirmishes.
But we have better things to do, I think.
Thank you. You have also said the practical challenge for India is to pursue a foreign policy that will continue to transform the country in an uncertain world. India has learned from failures in the early years, as well as its increasing success from the 1990s on. Now it must recalibrate some of its major relationship yet again. I wonder whether you could please elaborate your thinking on this matter.
Well, it seems to me we've gone through sort of three big phases. If you look at Indian foreign policy, foreign and security policy. India became independent and was plunged into a Cold War binary world where the Soviet Union, the US were competing with each other. India chose not to be part of that competition, chose to be non-aligned, like Sri Lanka, and chose, therefore, to try and expand the area of peace. That was one strategy, a way of dealing with it. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we entered a unipolar world. So what did we do? We started a multi-directional foreign policy, but first thing we did was transform our relationship with the US. I mean, it's from the 90s onwards that India started developing a much closer relationship with the US in economy and defense and a whole range of issues.
Nuclear field included.
In the nuclear in 2008, finally we opened it up. So we managed to transform that relationship into a close partnership over the last 30, 35 years through the 90s. After the global financial crisis, the US actually withdrew into itself to a certain extent. Not entirely, and the world became much more confused. And the way I see it, we are now in a period where the world itself, the globe as a whole, global geopolitics, it's multipolar economically, but militarily, there's only one country which can project military force or power around the globe, wherever it wants to, which is the US. And in political terms, it's thoroughly confused. Because economically, we're all interdependent, but politically, different ideologies, different ways of running our own business are claiming, whether it is in West Asia or whether it's between China, Russia, who have a certain view of how society and politics should be run. And there are different views on how the world should be run. The Soviets and the Americans, whatever it is, they both agreed on the system. It's just that they wanted you to choose their side. Today, You look at internet governance in the world, you have at least three basic differences. You have a US view about multiple stakeholders and private corporations running the internet. You have the European view, which is highly regulated, but private. And you have the state-centered sovereignty view of Russia and China. And you have various people in between. I mean, India, other countries have other views somewhere on this spectrum.
Okay.
So there's no agreement on how to run the world. There is no world order anymore. So today you're between orders, to my mind. I mean, the conventional wisdom is, oh, it's a multipolar world. It's not a multipolar world because the poles keep changing depending on which issues you look at. So therefore, I think we need to change strategy. We need to change what we do. You can't do the same thing and expect good results in a different situation. That's a variation on Einstein's definition of madness, right?
Right.
Doing the
Right.
same thing and expecting different results. So
Yes.
you need to, because the situation has changed, I think we need to change and we need to make up our own mind. And in every country, there is a debate going on about grand strategy. Whether it is in China, it's private. In the US, in India, in other countries, it's in the open about what kind of India do we want to build? How do we deal with the world? Every country has reacted to COVID, to the economic slowdown in the world economy by turning inward. We speak of self-reliance in India. China speaks of a dual circulation economy, stressing the domestic economy. The Americans speak of building back better for the American middle class. In other words, look at what happens at home rather than abroad. So everyone today is actually accelerating trends which started with the global financial crisis in 2008. We're turning inwards, we're becoming more nationalist. Geopolitics has acquired an edge. As I said, all the flashpoints, everything are much hotter. So, and because we have authoritarian leaders in many countries which matter, the potential of diplomacy, all that, frankly, is much lower. Because if you rely on nationalism, you can't do the give and take, the bargaining, the compromising that you have to do if you're going to negotiate your way out of trouble. Which is why, if you look at the complete collapse of the multilateral system in the face of COVID, or any transnational threat, whether it's climate change, whether it's, you can't say that the world the multilateral system has responded brilliantly to COVID. Well, here's a perfect example where you have a common interest. Institutions exist, WHO, the UN, G7, G20,
Yes.
you name it. But have any of them done anything meaningful? And so there is a real problem. We are between orders and we need to figure out a way to deal with it. I've said what I think in the last chapter, what I think India should do. But, and I also think that it requires actually more diplomacy, more engagement, much harder work actually to cope with this than with the previous two world orders that we've known. But let's see. I'm not
Thank you very much. Indeed, we have another 5-10 minutes more. I have a very interesting section of your chapter 12, where you have said, and I quote, India's interest is not in attempting to exclude maritime powers from the Indian Ocean, which is impossible, but to ensure the safety and security of the sea lanes. Unlike the continental domain, where territory can only be belong to one country or the other, the maritime domain is not subject to zero-sum security calculus. You have pointed out that the larger ones, like China and Japan, share the Indian interest in freedom of navigation in the high seas. And it should be possible for India to work with them to develop a regime, formal or informal, that ensures India's primary interests. To achieve this objective, you have highlighted the need to work out rules and arrangements that would enhance security and ensure freedom of navigation, which would include working with the United States, Japan, China, and the ASEAN partners like Singapore and Indonesia, as well as Australia. My question is whether such an objective could be achieved by trying to develop a code of conduct formal or otherwise, as you have mentioned, governing the Indian Ocean to be observed by all maritime powers? Or do you have another mechanism in mind?
Frankly, I haven't gone into the mechanism here because I think form should follow substance. And until there's a substantive agreement among all the countries, I think India and Sri Lanka have already been working for many years
Yes.
together on maritime security. And I think we probably have very similar views. But I personally think that form really depends on what you want to achieve. And for that, first, we need some kind of understanding, some kind of agreement among ourselves on what the goal is. If we agree on that among ourselves with the other powers, then I think we can find the form. It could be a code, it could be anything, it could be just rules of the road. It could be broken down into little bits and pieces about accidents at sea, about, it depends on the nature of the agreement between us and how wide it is and how deep it is, how much people are willing to actually invest in enforcing it. That I think is going to be the issue, because at the broadest level, everybody, it's like motherhood. Everybody will say, yes, yes, we agree, sea lanes must be secure, must be kept safe. But when you say, okay, what do we mean by that? Do we, and when we differ on some basics, we differ on the law of the sea, for instance, on what rights states have over their EEZ. What about military passage through our exclusive economic zones? Not all of us have the same views. Those are the kinds of issues we'll need to address if we are to actually deal with these. And I think we can. I don't think this is impossible, but it's going to take hard work. It'll take a lot of legwork. And it's not only because I'm trying to create jobs for other diplomats, but I think actually it is something that we really should be doing, because for Sri Lanka, for India, our prosperity, our economic future actually depends on the sea to a very great extent.
One area of interest is Indo-US relations. With regard to that relationship, you have expressed the view that the United States is no longer the engaged partner of the past, and it reflects structural changes in US internal politics. You have also highlighted that the common thread running through the foreign and security policies of successive governments of India until Modi government has been the pursuit of strategic autonomy for India. I repeat, strategic autonomy for India. Mm-hmm. Now, since you have attributed the US stance to internal politics of that country, do you think that the US policy would undergo transformation during the Biden administration? That is one question. Then as for the strategic autonomy for India, which you have spoke of, will India still go through military purchases such as the $5.2 billion S-400 deal with the Russian Federation, despite the stiff operation of the United States?
About the US approach, I'm not sure that the Biden administration would represent a shift in this long-term trend that we've seen towards much more internally focused US policy and reduced US willingness to be a provider of global public goods. I think Trump was probably an extreme, but the fact is that even previous US administrations, whether it was President Obama's, had all tried to actually limit the scope of US engagement abroad. And that has shrunk over time. So I don't think that will change fundamentally, because the US has domestic issues which will naturally predominate in our politics. And that's not only true of the US, it's true of China, it's true of India, it's true of a whole host of countries as we try and recalibrate ourselves. And actually, in some of our cases, the social contract is being renegotiated before our eyes. We can see it in our domestic politics. When you talk of redoing the Constitution, for instance, what are we talking about? We're talking about a basic restructuring of our country, of how we run our country. And in India as well, there's a fundamental discussion going on about what kind of India, what kind of state we want. That shift I don't see changing. So therefore, we're not going back to the old US. And I don't think we will see that very soon. Will India go on buying defense equipment from the Russians? Yes, I think because it's in our interest. I mean, the S-400 is the best system of its kind in the world. Nobody disputes that. So we're not going to get into, and that's what strategic autonomy means, that we make that decision based on what's in our interest, not based on how somebody else feels about it. The US, the law, CATSA, by the way, although the original draft didn't have it, the final act as it's passed includes a waiver provision. So
Okay.
there is, but the original bill didn't have it. And I'm glad they've added it. So the US has an option. They can exercise a waiver. And frankly, I think that is a test of how the US sees the partnership. Because, you know, previously, during the Cold War, the US was used to dealing with clients and allies. But now the US is speaking the language of partnership, not alliance and not client-patron relationships. And that's a very different thing. That doesn't mean that you can tell people what to buy and what not to buy. So I think if the US were to start applying sanctions because of the S-400, I think that would be a major mistake. I think that would be a huge underestimation of the strength of Indian national sentiment. I would be very surprised if they did, actually. I have a much higher regard for their good sense.
Thank you. I have come to the last question, which relates to free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. You have made a comment in this chapter, which says, and I quote, "Neither has the United States put forward a concept that takes into account the rise of India, China, and others in the region, other than an ill-defined and poorly resourced free and open Indo-Pacific strategy." So my question is, against this backdrop, how could the US and its partners stand up against or challenge BRI, which has been in operation for 7 years and has already invested billions of dollars across Asia? What is your opinion about this particular situation?
Well, you know, I don't think India's job or US job is to challenge BRI, because BRI itself is a pretty ill-defined concept. I mean, there is no one agreement which says what BRI is or how it will be implemented. There seem to be different ways of implementing bits and pieces of it. Some of it makes economic sense, some of it doesn't. This is all a matter of bilateral negotiation with China by the recipient countries. So I don't think India or the US should spend their time chasing BRI, not at all. I think we should, have much more faith in the recipient countries. After all, they know what they're doing, they know what they're getting. And they are going to defend their own independence and their own ability to run their own countries. So I don't think we should underestimate that factor. Secondly, what's wrong with infrastructure, so long as it is open to everybody to use? It's transparent,
yes,
and it's open. I mean, I use the example very often in India about Colombo Port. I mean, the Chinese have invested money in some of it. They've invested effort. Their own people have built some of it. India uses it. We get the use of it. The port, therefore, makes money and pays back whatever it has to. And it's a good, successful example. I have no problem. Therefore, I don't think we should therefore be opposing everything that's BRI or that China is doing. I think it's the terms, and this varies so much from place to place. I mean, each port project, each infrastructure project, each one seems to be unique and often renegotiated over and over again. That is something quite different. But I think we should do what is good for us. What is good for us? Connectivity for us is good, but it can't be exclusive. It can't be only for us. It can't be only for China. It can't be only for the US. We need to work on building the economic interdependences. And I think if it works for all of us, use it. I don't see a problem with that. So my attitude to BRI and free and open, I don't see is an answer to BRI at all. In fact, for me, free and open is more about the maritime space and the maritime and the uses of it and keeping it safe and secure for everyone. BRI, I think, is the world's biggest connectivity project. It might be designed with whatever in mind, but today it has become actually a huge, amorphous, and I'm not even sure that it's a shape-shifting being. And I think we should deal with it pragmatically on the ground and work with our partners on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think we are coming close to our end of our session. Before I have finished my questions, I'm sure there are questions from the audience. If that is the case, I think this is the time for those questions to be taken up. Over to you, Amira.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Ambassador Menon, we have two questions. I think the first one you've basically answered, but I'm going to read it out to you anyway. It's from Portia Kem. She says, what are your thoughts on the increasing presence of China in Sri Lanka? And she has cited the port city and other infrastructure development as examples. How will India look at it? Will India, especially given its national interests, how will India perceive them? That's the first question. The other is, often India appoints a retired IFS ambassador as the national security advisor. Could you express the advantage of it, as this side of the Pork Strait would never dream such a thing? We have another question.
Yeah.
What are the fundamental differences between BJP and INC in shaping India's foreign policies? Why the Modi administration has a deep grudge against you as one of the most important diplomats during National Congress's rule? If there are any other questions, please post it on the chat or raise your hand. For the time being, we'll answer these three, Ambassador Menon, please.
Okay. About the increased Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, I have faith in Sri Lanka. And I know how strongly Sri Lankans feel about their own independence, their own ability to run their own affairs. And so for me, I maybe am slightly less worried than some of the Indian media and some of the other public commentators. But I do think that from an Indian point of view, it's very important that we leave our Sri Lankan friends in no doubt about what the red lines are that would worry us. What are the things that could affect Indian security? And that conversation, I'm sure, is going on between the two governments. That's something that is essential because you don't want to get into a position where through misunderstanding, where Sri Lanka then crosses one of those red lines and then it starts affecting India-Sri Lanka relations, which it shouldn't. So frankly, this is something that will keep evolving. And it's something that both sides need to talk to each other very, very often and in great detail regularly. That for me is the real answer. But I have faith in that Sri Lanka knows what it's doing and that Sri Lanka will make the right choices. There I have faith. About retired foreign service people as NSAs, there have been 3 who were retired foreign service out of the 5. 2 were retired directors of the intelligence bureau, were actually from the police. Is there an advantage to one or the other? I think it depends on what the government is looking for at a particular time. The purpose of the NSC, the National Security Council, and the NSA is to take a comprehensive view, a holistic view of India's security. In fact, the NSC was set up after Kargil at a time when we were facing cross-border terrorism, when we had become a nuclear power, a nuclear weapon state, and where the kinds of challenges we faced could no longer be dealt with in traditional silos by just the armed forces or just the police or just, and therefore it was felt, and where technology was becoming more and more important. So we needed to take a holistic view. So ultimately, it depends on the individual. I mean, you can't say that just because he's a foreign service officer or just because he belongs to the police, he's going to be better or worse. I think a lot depends on who the person is and who the government feels will give them the right advice on the issues that preoccupy them the most at that time. And that has evolved over time. So I don't think I wouldn't make an argument saying it should always be one or the other. Or point to any other stream that as the only one that will produce the right people to be NSA. What are the fundamental differences between the BJP and the Indian National Congress? I'll leave it to them to take care of their own problems, because I have always been an apolitical civil servant. If they don't like me, they've hidden the fact very well from me. They talk to me. We discuss issues. So as I like to say, I was sent to Israel by Narasimha Rao, Congress, to Sri Lanka by Gujral, United Front, to China and Pakistan by Mr. Vajpayee, BJP, and brought home as Foreign Secretary by the Congress and made NSA by the Congress. So I'm not sure, and I would like to think of myself as still apolitical. Other people might not see it that way, because it's not easy to be apolitical in a polarized political situation. But that's what I will try for.
We have one question from Mrs. De Silva. Do you mind unmuting yourself and posing your question, Mrs. De Silva?
I enjoyed listening to this discussion. It was fascinating. And actually, a few issues that I had in my mind came up during the discussion to the questions posed by Ambassador Goonetilleke, particularly regarding the third amendment issue. And then one question that came from the audience about the Chinese presence and any perception that India may be having on this. So I think altogether it was a very useful discussion, and I really benefited a lot by that. So I thank both Ambassador Menon and Ambassador Goonetilleke, and of course Pathfinder for organizing this event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. De Silva. Ambassador, can we take one more question? I know we've run out of time. Just one more. Says, what is the connotation of President Biden using secure, prosperous Indo-Pacific in addition or in substitution of the term free and open? Does it mean that the US Indo-Pacific policy under Biden would be fundamentally different from his predecessors?
In this kind of passing official statements, I would rather do what the old Chinese saying is, which is listen to his words, but watch his actions. I would rather see what the US does. If what it does is different, then these words are significant. But no politician likes to use his predecessor's words. And especially in democratic systems, every new person says, I have a better new policy, we'll use a new set of words. But I would rather watch what the US does and then come to a conclusion about whether the US has changed track or changed policy. Actually, their commitment to the free and open Indo-Pacific is one thing that came through very quickly, very soon, and was continued. And on China policy as well, So far, at least, the US has not indicated major fundamental shifts or on policy towards India. So it's, I think, still early days, but I wouldn't go by just the words. I would still wait and see whether their actions change.
Mr. Goonetilleke, we have one more question.
Okay, all right. If we can manage that.
Okay, the final question. What will be the long-term impact, if there is any, of New Delhi's inadequacy in dealing with the COVID pandemic, say upon its clout and role in regional and global affairs?
My own sense is that COVID has actually accelerated existing trends. It's more likely to have more effect actually internally on internal politics than it is on the international system or on how countries deal with each other. Countries have always dealt with each other pretty cynically, pretty transactionally, and in terms of their own interests. And we will get past COVID. I mean, this is not going to be here forever. And frankly, if you look at the fundamentals of the Indian economy, if you look at how India was before and how she's likely to be after, I still see other countries dealing with India in their own interest, not out of any sense of, what COVID, how well or badly India managed COVID. So for me, in fact, I don't even believe that, vaccine diplomacy or gratitude or any of these things have very long-lasting effects in international relations. So I actually think that what we're seeing now is just an acceleration of the turning inwards in most of our societies, of more fractious domestic politics, of actually a sharpening of contradictions between states. All that, thanks to COVID, has actually been accelerated. But so far, COVID hasn't changed the basics, the fundamentals of how countries work with each other and what they're aiming at. That we haven't seen. If it lasts for 5-10 years, maybe. But I don't think that's where we are headed, and I certainly hope not.
Amira, are
That's
we
it.
done?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, we are done.
lovely. Thank you, Ambassador Menon. On behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation, I would like to express our sincere appreciation for being with us this afternoon and sharing your experiences as well as insights to the multifaceted issues facing South Asia as well as other countries. And we also would like to mention in appreciation the support you have extended, support and cooperation you have extended to the Pathfinder Foundation in the past. And we certainly hope that we will be able to continue our exchanges and cooperation in the future as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really good of you, and I enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a
All
real
the best.
pleasure. All the best.
All